What's up, summoners? King Blair here. Epic 7 is a game that has a very expansive list of characters with a bunch of different things that they do in the different roles, and it can be overwhelming for new players and for older players when they're talking about to use a lot of different terms. So what we're going to be talking about today is all the different types of units that are in Epic 7, giving you the basic introduction to them, and also telling you some of the standard builds that some of these units have, because that is going to be something that you should kind of know, and that's a video for another day. But with that, if you do like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server. Link down in the description. Without further ado, let's get through all the different types of units in the game, whether they're bruisers, speed units, speed contesters, DPSs, all that jazz. So let's get right into it. If I miss one, let me know in the comments, and I will make sure to pin it with all the changed information. With that, let's start with the unit types, starting with none other than one of the more popular ones more recently, which is going to be none other than the Bruisers. So Bruisers are typically going to be your very bulky type of units. They're units that are there to stick on the board, and they're there to be there for a long time. Typically, they are going to be running things like counter sets and lifesteal sets to try to sustain in the fight and do consistent damage. They don't particularly care about taking turn one. They're not there to kill the opponent in one turn. They're there to slowly break them down and tear apart their defenses with their high strength heals. One thing to note is they typically don't have very high ER, with the exception of things like Ken, so they're often very prone to getting controlled, which is why things like Fairy Tail Tenebra and Angel Light Angelica can have pretty good matchups into booster type units. They often will get controlled quite easily and can get bursted down by some higher DPS units out there. So again, Bruisers, there are a lot of different units. There's some examples right here of some of the Bruisers, but again, typically bulky type units. They're typically going to have over 15k HP and can take a very good amount of hits and sustain them over time, right? And there are units that can have Bruiser builds such as Landy, where they're trying to stay alive for longer. So big DPS units that we'll talk about later can also be Bruisers. And that's an important thing to know with all these different units. They can be part of different categories. So that's very important to note, since there's going to be a lot of categories. But next up is going to be the tank type units. Tanks are there to soak up damage, particularly through things like Aureus and Adamant Shield, and just by providing support for the team, right? So things like Fallen Cecilia with the barrier, Craw with the defense buff, also with Aureus, Ross with the defense buff, Crimson Armin with the invincibility, as well as the Renal Adamant Shield, and even things like Ruel, who can also be considered supports that we'll talk about in a second, are also going to be soaking up a lot of damage, especially in things like Guild Wars, where you tap them in to let a dark unit just completely rail on them. They're going to be surviving, they're going to be letting your team survive longer, and you're there to let your team survive for a very long time and mitigate how much damage you're taking. Now, with the exception of Ruel, tanks typically will have access to Aureus and Adamant Shield, and they're going to stick around on the board for a very long time. They don't particularly do a lot of damage. They're there more for support and to allow other units the time that they need to actually crack through your opponent's teams. So tanks, very solid, very critical to a majority of playstyles in the game, and really good. Often will have some ER to them. So you need to understand that tanks will often have 100 to 150 ER, but they typically won't be faster than 220 speed, right? That's usually the range for the stat lines for them, and that's important to note because it's very rare that a unit will outspeed you. Every once in a while, you'll run into a 240 speed Fallen Cecilia, but those are quite rare. But yes, they have some effect resistance, so regular debuffs won't land on them as easily. You'll have to make sure you have some effectiveness to actually be able to hit these high, this strong tank teams, since they're just there to soak up damage and help the team out. Then we're moving on to buff supports. Again, buff supports can be tanks, just like tanks can be buff supports. But buff supports are going to be there to provide buffs for your team and make and give you a big advantage, right? So typically these are units that are going to be giving you things like attack buff. They're going to be giving you things like defense buff. They're going to be giving you a lot of different buffs, but they're also going to be making sure your team is alive and can utilize them, right? So when we think of Diane, she's giving barriers, she can heal with her artifact, and she's just always keeping these buff ups and giving you a bunch of advantage. Made Chloe giving you the attack buff, giving you the revive buff, and then healing every other turn. Healing and healing is a big part of being a buff support, right? You also have Amelia, who gives attack buff, CR pushes you up and is able to give you a bunch of advantage. And then even things like General Purgus, right? Who you wouldn't really think as a support, but he's really giving you a lot, right? He's giving you combat readiness in the fight. He's also going to be giving you attack buff, right? So it's units that are giving you advantage through buffs as well as through just generally what they're going to be doing. So just really good options and just general supports. It's kind of hard. You could go into a wide variety of supports like healing supports, advantage supports, but just generally support type units. The big thing with these supports is they're going to have really good effect resistance, often well above 150. Why is that? Well, you don't want your buffs getting stripped and you want to make sure they're taking turns. If they're getting provoked, if they're getting locked down, that means you're not getting these critical buffs out, which means you're not getting to do your skills. So that's why they will often have very high FRES, often between 150 to 200 and sometimes even higher for things like Amelia. They will also be quite fast. They can go upwards to 240 to 250 speed. They're not going to be outspeeding a cleave, but they are going to have pretty good speed to make sure that they're actually able to get the buffs before the rest of the team actually goes. So that's typically how these units are going to be functioning, and they're still tanky to stick around the board to make sure they can consistently apply those supports. Next up, we have another type of support, which is going to be the cleansers, and cleansers are very important in this game, especially with things like Angel, Light, Angelica just completely stomping right now in the meta and being able to put a lot of debuffs on the board, and even things like a Tywin. Cleansers are there to make sure that you're not getting debuffed. It's very basic, and they are a form of support, right? Which is support is a really huge category, so that's why I split it up into a couple. So for cleansers, what they're trying to do, again, very simple: remove debuffs from cleansers and provide continued support, right? Make sure that once they do their job, they're still going to stick around to threaten the debuffers so that they don't keep debuffing you, right? Or to make it so that they're still something the opponent has to deal with. So again, pretty basic. It's just remove the buffs, right? Typically, these units will have the single highest ER in the game, over 200 easily, right? Which means that you'll need a dedicated debuffer in order to actually get the debuffs in, and we'll talk about the debuffers later on. But if you're not having some insane levels of debuff potential and hard CC, these units are going to make it very hard for you to actually control the pace of the game with your control type units, right? And just that initial pressure that they provide is enough. So again, a type of support, extremely high ER, that's the big thing. As far as speed, they're not usually very fast because they just need to be as faster than the team, right? Make sure that they go right after you apply their debuffs. So sometimes, often between 200 to 220 speed, to just be fast enough to be able to cycle and get their skills, but slow enough that they're allowing the debuffers to go first. So you don't really need the insane speed gear on these. Then we have the general DPSs, which is going to be a very large category. You have just general DPS, and then you also had speed DPSs. The speed DPSs are often a part of cleave, right? And they're often there to do very high damage. When we think of units like Pavel, that's a cleave type unit. They do huge damage and they're kind of out. And then you have some that are just there throughout the fight, and that's most of the general DPS. So what are they trying to do? Do damage, right? They will often have very high burst damage to be able to kill squishier type units, and then will be able to sustain with really good damage throughout the fight. Think something like Spectre Tenebria, Landy, all the units on here have a very powerful initial burst that is able to put a bunch of pressure on the opponent, but then also have a lot of sustained damage afterwards to be able to carry the damage on your team. It's important that you always have at least one type of DPS if you're going for a very aggro team, or a Bruiser. Either can work, but you really need something to actually be putting damage on the enemy, because if you're not putting damage, you're not going to be winning the fight. For general DPSs, unlike Bruisers, they can be quite fast. So it very much depends on what they're going for. For cleavers, you're going to be seeing units that are faster than 240 for cleave type DPSs. For slower DPSs like Landy Stennet, you will often see them at around 200. And for Kisa, you can see they're upwards to 280 to 290. So these units, again, they're the ones carrying the damage in a lot of the fights. They're pumping a lot of damage in, and they're helping you take turns, right? Which is typically why they're anywhere between 200 to 260 speed, depending what it requires, right? And what the team composition you're running with. But again, it's always nice to have a DPS type unit, and DPS being damage per second, right? So you're able to do a lot of damage. The next up, we have none other than the debuffers. Now, there's quite a lot of these, including one Light Angelica, which is not included in the very pretty pictures that I have on this slide. But the big thing with the debuffers is they're controlling the pace of the game, right? You're trying to apply so many debuffs on the opponent that they're afraid to do certain skills, or you slow them down from taking critical skills, right? So when we think of that, units like Cerise that are applying the slow, that are applying the restrict, that are making it hard for the opponent to move and do what they want to do, and they're forced to watch you get the control of the fight, right? Same thing with a Tywin, able to lock down the full team with provokes with the S1, and then S3s being able to stun and stun and slow down, my bad, and speed down. Then you also have things like Polides, right? Who is stopping the opponent from getting CR push, applying unable to be buffed, stripping buffs if they do on a skill that is not an attack skill. So again, she's controlling the pace of the game. She's controlling what's going on. And even things like Sage Ball, who are sleeping, cutting, sleeping, and just stopping the pace of the game. So again, it allows you to disrupt the opponent and take away their advantage by either stripping the opponent, by either applying very strong debuffs that are not going to let them do the damage that they need to do to kill you, or by just stunning them and not even letting them play the game, right? So debuffers, very, very nice. Not something you always need to have on teams, but always really good to help control the pace of the game. And again, a really strong playstyle right now because of Light Angelica being able to really control the pace of the game. Then we have the speed contesters, one of the smaller categories, but this word gets thrown out a lot. Same with this playstyle, or not playstyle, but these type of units. So essentially, these are going to be units that are there to threaten speed cleave type units. These are units that naturally have very high base speeds. Usually high speed DPSs and usually even openers have a base speed of around 115, right? Well, these units are well above 115, often pushing 120 plus speed starting, which allows you to build them faster than your opponent and threaten anything that doesn't have initial protection. This makes things like cleave very, very dangerous, because if you slap on something like an Assassin Sid, the opponent is forced to respect it and usually forced to ban it. Or in an arena situation, if you have a very strong Ace Sid and they don't have damage mitigation with the tanks and the knights, you're able to come in with your Assassin Sid and one-shot Light Angelica, right? And that really threatens the board. It threatens anything that wants to open the game. It threatens anything that's squishy and wants to apply pressure, right? And having speed contesters is always really, really good. And you can even threaten things like Strasse, because a lot of people run very fast Strasses, but don't run any mitigation with them, allowing you to easily kill them with some of the speed contesters and really threaten that advantage. And then last, but definitely not least, we have the openers slash engagers. So these are going to be units that are guaranteeing you turn one. They're the units that are opening the fight for you and making sure that you have the advantage you need to create your place, right? This is often seen in very aggressive team type compositions where taking turn one actually matters. And again, as we mentioned, there's a lot of different units that fall into this category. Things like Amelia could be considered an opener or an engager, right? Because someone like Amelia is usually opening and giving that attack buff. General Purgus, you have a very fast General Purgus team. He can be considered an engager or an opener because he's opening the fight with a very strong buff, right? So these are typically units that are helping you get that turn one advantage and able to get a lot out of it. Basar, being able to push back the opponent and apply unable to be buffed. Really, really good for Guild Wars and used to be really good for Arena until Light Angelica, although the CR push is still very nice to have. Again, he's gating you that turn one advantage as well as applying those debuffs. Berto Tenebria, a very popular option right now. She takes away turn one advantage by making sure that the opponent cannot use any of their skills, applies very nasty debuffs, and sets up the rest of your team for success. Same thing with Flange, she's able to push up. Operator Sigrid, she's able to push back and give attack buff. Faithless Lidica pushes your whole team up and sets up, right? All these units are basically there to help you get that initial turn one, help you get that advantage so you can steamroll that with damage and win the fight. Again, very often used in highly, highly aggressive team compositions like Cleave or aggro teams. Sometimes you can't use them in Bruiser teams if taking turn one advantage would give you really good advantage, right? If you have a Landy or a Strasse, right, in your Bruiser team, giving that Strasse the opportunity to one-shot the opponent's tanks will set you up for success, or even having something like an open closer Charles, following up after an opener, making sure that you're able to get that initial advantage and make it to a point where the opponent does not have the means to actually come back. So that's going to be it for all the different types of units that are in Epic 7. I know there's quite a lot that you could definitely think about and consider. But yeah, that is going to be all for this video. Hopefully y'all enjoyed and have a better understanding and idea on how all these different units work and how kind of like the terms that get thrown around a lot when you're building your teams. So that's all I got for you guys today, and I will see you next time. Peace.